The first man who walked across the ranch after the bank sold it almost missed the hole. It wasn't much to look at, just a dark circle hidden beneath waist-high sagebrush, barely wider than an old truck tire. Years of dust had settled over its rim, and dry grass leaned across it as though nature itself had tried to erase its existence. Another step, and his boot would have covered it completely. Instead, he stopped. He looked down for only a moment before continuing toward the abandoned house. Back then, nobody imagined that forgotten hole would one day be worth more than every acre surrounding it. The bank certainly didn't. By the spring of 1984, everyone in Red Willow County believed the Harper Ranch was finished. The newspapers called it another casualty of the farm crisis. Auction flyers described it in only a few cold sentences. 1,280 acres. House in poor condition. Water unreliable. Structures deteriorated. Sold as is. Not one word mentioned the family who had spent nearly 70 years trying to keep that land alive. Not one word mentioned the machine sitting inside the weather equipment shed, or the promise buried beneath the earth. The auction lasted less than 12 minutes. Most bidders never even stepped out of their pickups. They looked across miles of brown grass, cracked ponds, collapsing fences, and a windmill that hadn't turned in years. One man laughed. "That place isn't a ranch anymore," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's a bill nobody wants." Several others nodded. The bank representative didn't argue. He simply wanted the property off the books. When the final bid came in, there wasn't even applause. The ranch sold for less than the price of a new pickup truck. Some shook their heads. Others climbed into their vehicles before the paperwork was finished. To them, it was over. But stories like this rarely begin where people think they do. To understand why one forgotten hole changed everything, you have to meet the man who refused to leave. Walter Harper wasn't the kind of rancher newspapers wrote about. He never broke production records. He never appeared on television. He never gave speeches at agricultural meetings. If you drove past his ranch, you probably wouldn't remember it. But everyone remembered Walter. He spoke softly, worked slowly, and fixed almost everything instead of replacing it. Neighbors joked that Walter had never thrown away a bolt in his life. The strange part was they weren't wrong. Inside coffee cans lined across his workshop sat thousands of carefully sorted nuts, washers, cotter pins, springs, bearings, and bolts collected over nearly 40 years. If somebody built it once, Walter liked to say, somebody can build again. Most people smiled politely. A few rolled their eyes, because by the early 1980s, America had fallen in love with new equipment, bigger tractors, bigger loans, bigger promises. Walter trusted none of them. Every dollar he saved went into repairing what already worked. His pride wasn't parked outside the house. It lived quietly inside an aging wood machine shed whose roof leaked every spring. Covered beneath decades of dust stood a machine almost everyone else had forgotten. A 1956 Caterpillar D6 crawler tractor. Its yellow paint had faded to the color of old straw. The steel tracks were polished smooth by thousands of hours pushing dirt, clearing brush, pulling cedar stumps, and dragging irrigation pipe across unforgiving ground. Visitors often asked why Walter never traded it in. He'd simply smile. You don't replace someone who still shows up every morning. Most assumed he was joking. He wasn't. Because that Caterpillar wasn't just another machine. It carried the fingerprints of 3 generations. Walter's father, Thomas Harper, bought it brand new in the autumn of 1956 after selling 200 head of Hereford cattle during one of the strongest livestock markets the county had seen. The price stunned everyone. Almost $14,000. Enough money to buy a respectable house in many parts of America. Neighbors called Thomas reckless. Banks called it unnecessary. Thomas called it insurance. "This tractor won't make me rich," he told Walter when the machine arrived on a flatbed truck. "It'll keep us from becoming poor." For nearly 30 years, it did exactly that. Every scar on its blade marked another season survived. Every dent carried a memory. The deep scratch running along the left side came from the blizzard of 1967, when Thomas pushed snow for 18 straight hours to reach trapped cattle. The bent handrail appeared after Walter slipped while repairing a fence, and the crawler rolled just enough to save him from being crushed beneath a cedar tree. Even the worn leather seat wasn't original. Walter's wife, Eleanor, stitched its replacement cover by hand one winter while sitting beside the wood stove. She joked that the tractor spent more evenings inside their conversations than most neighbors did. Walter never disagreed, because machines like that earn something modern equipment rarely does: a place inside the family. And somehow, the old caterpillar always seemed to know when it was needed most. Then came the drought. One dry summer became two. Creeks disappeared. Stock ponds shrank into muddy circles. Grass that once reached a horse's knees barely covered a rabbit's feet. Banks grew nervous. Interest rates climbed. Loans became impossible. Families who had survived floods, blizzards, and cattle disease suddenly found themselves losing ranches because numbers on paper changed faster than rainfall ever could. Walter borrowed only when he had no other choice. But even careful men can drown when the water never comes. By late 1983, he was months behind. The bank manager had stopped talking about solutions. Now, he only talked about deadlines. One cold November afternoon, Walter stood outside the barn as a black sedan rolled slowly into the yard. The man climbing out wore polished shoes far too clean for ranch country. He glanced around once, twice, then wrote something inside a leather notebook. Walter already knew what it was: property condition, asset evaluation, estimated recovery value. Not once did the banker ask about the old hole hidden beneath the sagebrush beyond the western pasture, because nobody remembered it anymore. Not even Walter knew its true story. He only knew one thing: his grandfather had warned him, whatever happens, never fill that hole. Walter had obeyed those words for decades. He just never knew why. And before winter was over, someone else was going to find out first. Walter stood for a long time after the banker's sedan disappeared in a cloud of pale dust. The ranch was silent, except for the wind rubbing against the cottonwoods behind the house. People often imagine silence as peaceful. Out on a struggling ranch, silence can be frightening. It means no calves bawling in the pasture, no irrigation pump humming, no hired hands laughing over coffee, only the sound of unpaid bills sitting inside the kitchen drawer. Walter finally turned toward the machine shed. The heavy wooden door groaned as he slid it open. Sunlight spilled through broken roof boards, cutting bright lines across the old Caterpillar D6. Dust floated lazily through the air, making the tractor look almost sacred, as though time itself had decided not to disturb it. He rested one weathered hand on the cold steel blade. "I suppose it's just you and me again," he said quietly. The old crawler, of course, said nothing. It never had. But Walter always believed a good machine answered with its reliability instead of its voice. He reached beneath the dashboard, pumped a fuel primer exactly 3 times, and pulled the decompression lever. Every movement happened from memory. He could have done it blindfolded. When he pressed the starter, the diesel engine rolled over once, twice, then exploded into life with a deep, steady growl that echoed across the empty ranch. The sound startled a flock of meadowlarks into sky. For a moment, the place felt alive again. Walter smiled. "Still here," he whispered. People who never worked around old machinery often misunderstand why ranchers become attached to it. They think it's sentimentality. It usually isn't. It's trust. A modern machine can impress you in the dealership parking lot. An old machine earns your respect one impossible day at a time. Walter's Caterpillar had done both. It had pulled stuck cattle trailers through spring mud. It had cleared miles of snow after the blizzard of 1978. It had dragged fallen cottonwoods off county roads when no one else could reach them. Every repair had been recorded in a small black notebook Eleanor kept inside the kitchen cabinet. Date, hours, parts replaced, oil used, fuel consumed. Nothing fancy. Just neat handwriting stretching across nearly 30 years. Walter often joked that if the tractor ever forgot who it was, Eleanor's notebook could remind it. After she passed away, he never moved that notebook. Some evenings he still opened it, not because the machine needed maintenance, but because it felt like hearing her voice again. The foreclosure papers arrived 3 weeks before Christmas. There was no dramatic knock at the door, no argument, just a white envelope inside the mailbox. Walter carried it into the kitchen without opening it. He already knew every sentence waiting inside. The coffee on the stove had gone cold. The calendar hanging beside the refrigerator still showed October, because Eleanor had always been the one who remembered to turn the page. He looked around the room. Every chair carried a memory. Every scratch in the wooden table belonged to another meal, another birthday, another harvest. Banks don't calculate memories. They calculate collateral. He finally unfolded the papers. 90 days. That was all. After that, the Harper Ranch would belong to someone else. Word spread quickly across Red Willow County. It always did. By New Year's Day, people at Miller's feed store were already discussing who might buy the ranch. Probably some investment outfit. They'll split it into hunting leases. No point trying to graze cattle there anymore. One younger rancher laughed. They ought to bulldoze the whole place and start over. Old Ben Carter looked up from his coffee. You ever tell Walter that? The young man shrugged. I wouldn't have to. Ben nodded slowly. That's because you've never had to earn a living with your hands. The conversation ended there. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone respected Ben enough not to argue. A week later, Walter climbed onto the Caterpillar before sunrise. There was one fence line along the western ridge that still needed clearing before winter storms arrived. Nobody would have blamed him for letting it collapse. The ranch wasn't going to be as much longer, but Walter had never believed ownership was the reason to take care of land. You cared for land because someone had cared for it before you, and because someday someone else might care for it after you. The crawler climbed the ridge at barely 3 miles an hour. Slow, patient, unhurried. Walter preferred it that way. You learn more moving slow, his father used to say. Halfway across the western pasture, the blade struck something hidden beneath decades of packed earth. Clang. Walter stopped immediately. Steel against stone. Not unusual. The ranch had plenty of buried rock. He backed up, lowered the blade again. Another metallic sound. Not stone. Something hollow. He climbed down, brushed away loose dirt with his boot. Only a few inches below the surface, he uncovered the edge of old timber. Perfectly squared. Weathered. Artificial. Walter frowned. He had worked this pasture for nearly 40 years. How had he never noticed this? He knelt and cleared more soil with his hands. The timber formed part of the circle. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened again. A memory surfaced from somewhere deep inside his childhood. His grandfather's voice. Don't ever fill that hole, son. Walter looked toward the patch of sagebrush 50 yards away. The forgotten hole. Then back at the buried timber. The two lined up almost perfectly. For the first time in decades, he wondered if they belonged together. A cold wind swept across the ridge. Walter stood without another word. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for a very long time. He climbed back onto the Caterpillar, shut off the engine, and stared across the empty pasture. He wasn't looking at dry grass anymore. He was looking at questions. Questions no one in his family had lived long enough to answer. And hundreds of miles away, the bank was already preparing the paperwork that would transfer the ranch to its new owner, never knowing that beneath one forgotten pasture lay the first clue to something that had been waiting untouched for generations. Walter Harper did not sleep that night. The wind rattled the loose tin on the machine's shed roof, but it wasn't the wind keeping him awake. It was a memory of his grandfather's voice, clearer now than it had been in years. Whatever happens, never fill that hole. As a boy, Walter had asked why. His grandfather, Samuel Harper, had only smiled beneath the brim of his weathered hat, because someday someone will need what's under more than what's above it. Walter had assumed the old man was talking about water. Every rancher talked about water, but now he wasn't so sure. At first light, Walter filled a thermos with coffee, grabbed Eleanor's old notebook, a shovel, a digging bar, and drove the Caterpillar toward the western pasture. The crawler's diesel echoed across the frozen ground. It sounded almost eager. The buried timbers he'd uncovered the day before were exactly where he'd left them. He climbed down and began digging by hand. The soil was surprisingly loose beneath the surface, as though it had once been disturbed and then forgotten. Within an hour, nearly 6 feet of curved timber had emerged. It wasn't random. It formed a perfect ring. Old-growth oak, hand-hewn with broad axes. Walter ran his fingers across the grain. Whoever built this had done it long before bulldozers ever reached Red Willow County. Then he noticed something else. Iron, large, square-headed spikes, black with age but still holding. "This isn't a fence," he whispered. By noon, old Ben Carter pulled into the pasture. He climbed out carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "I figured you'd forget lunch." Walter smiled. "You figured right." Ben looked into the excavation. "What V you got?" "I honestly don't know." The 2 old ranchers spent several quiet minutes studying the exposed timber. Finally, Ben spoke. "My grandfather mentioned something once." Walter looked up. "What?" "A government survey crew, maybe around 1910, said they came looking for underground water around this part of the county." Walter frowned. "I've never heard that." "Neither had I." Folks dismissed it as another coffee shop story. Ben pointed toward the distant sagebrush. "But they kept talking about an old spring." Walter slowly turned toward the forgotten hole. The distance between them suddenly felt much shorter. By the following afternoon, curiosity had begun spreading across the county. Curiosity travels much faster than sympathy. 3 pickup trucks parked along Walter's fence. People climbed out pretending they had simply been driving by. "What are you digging? Found treasure? Looking for gold?" Walter answered every question the same way. "Don't know yet." Most laughed. One younger man leaned against his truck. "You know the bank owns this place now." Walter nodded. "For another 3 weeks. Seems like wasted effort." Walter looked calmly at him. "So, does planting a seed before winter?" The young man had no answer. Around sunset, another pickup arrived. Unlike the others, this one carried a county historical survey emblem on the door. Out stepped Margaret Ellis. She couldn't have been older than 40, but everyone in the county knew her reputation. If something old existed within 100 miles, Margaret probably knew about it. She climbed carefully into the excavation. Her flashlight swept across the timber. Then she froze. "Don't touch another thing." Walter looked concerned. "Why?" She pointed toward one of the beams. "See these tool marks?" Walter nodded. They weren't made by sawmills. She brushed away another layer of dirt. Hand-carved Roman numerals appeared near one joint. Margaret inhaled sharply. "This structure predates your ranch." "How much?" She looked up. "Possibly by 50 years." Walter blinked. "That's impossible." "No," she said quietly. "It's just forgotten." That evening, Margaret spread old county maps across Walter's kitchen table. Most were yellow with age. Several had been copied by hand. One map stopped them both, dated 1881, long before the Harper family ever owned the ranch. Across the western pasture, someone had drawn a tiny blue circle. Beside it, only 2 faded words remained readable. "Living Spring." Walter stared without speaking. Margaret traced another faded line, extending eastward. "Look at this." The blue line disappeared beneath what later became Harper property. "It keeps going." Walter followed it with his finger. "Toward the creek?" Margaret nodded. "No." She smiled slightly. "Toward the entire valley." The technical digression. People often imagine underground water as enormous rivers flowing beneath the earth. In reality, that's rarely how it works. Most groundwater moves slowly through layers of sand, gravel, fractured rock, or porous soil. Think of a giant natural sponge rather than an underground river. A spring appears where pressure forces that stored water back to surface. If the underground pathway becomes blocked by sediment, collapsed timber, or years of neglect, the spring can seem to disappear, even though the water is still there. Old ranchers didn't have satellite surveys or digital maps. They watched where snow melted first, where certain grasses stayed green during drought, and where livestock instinctively gathered. Their experience often revealed water that modern surveys overlooked because they spent decades reading the land instead of simply measuring it. Margaret rolled up the map. "If this spring still exists." Walter finished the sentence. "It could water half this ranch." "Or more." Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, the old caterpillar sat beneath the fading evening sky. Walter looked toward the shed. My grandfather knew. Margaret nodded. I think he did. But why keep it secret? Margaret folded her arms. Maybe he wasn't hiding it. She glanced toward the foreclosure, noticed lying on the counter. Maybe he was waiting for someone who wouldn't sell it. Walter looked out the window. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about losing the ranch. He was thinking about earning it back. The next morning, the bank's field representative arrived unexpectedly. He stepped out of the sedan, wearing polished boots that were already collecting dust. His eyes immediately found the excavation. What exactly is going on here? Walter answered honestly. I'm trying to understand what my grandfather left behind. The representative frowned. You understand any permanent excavation now belongs to the property owner. Walter smiled faintly. It still belongs to me. For 18 more days. The man scribbled notes. I'd advise you not to invest much effort. Walter looked toward the old caterpillar, then toward the forgotten hole beyond the sagebrush. He simply replied, I've never regretted honest work. The representative climbed back into his sedan, but before driving away, he made a phone call, a call that would bring people from outside Red Willow County, people with equipment, people with lawyers, and people who suddenly believed the worthless ranch might not be worthless after all. As the dust settled behind the departing car, Walter heard a faint sound drifting across the pasture, not from the road, not from the wind, from the forgotten hole itself. It was almost impossible to hear. A slow, steady, rhythmic drip, as if something deep beneath the ranch had just awakened. Soil, not aggressively, carefully, patiently. Each pass removed only a few inches. Modern excavators attacked the earth. Walter believed good ground deserved an introduction first. Have you ever owned something everyone else called worthless, only to discover that the people laughing had never taken the time to understand it? Maybe it wasn't a machine. Maybe it was a family business, an old house, a skill your parents taught you, or even your own dream. Sometimes the world mistakes quiet value for no value at all. And by the time everyone else notices, the patient person has already finished the work. Just before sunset, the caterpillar's blade exposed something impossible. Stone, not random rock. Perfectly fitted limestone blocks. Margaret hurried forward. Oh my! Walter climbed down. Together they brushed away decades of packed dirt. A narrow stone tunnel appeared beneath the timbers. Its ceiling was barely high enough for a man to crawl through. Cold air drifted from inside, not the warm breath of dry earth. Cool, moist, living air. Margaret shined her flashlight into the darkness. The beam disappeared around a gentle curve. I think, she whispered, this is an old spring gallery. Walter frowned. A what? A hand-built underground water tunnel. She looked at him with disbelief. People built these before modern drilling equipment existed. Walter stared silently into the darkness. Someone, long before his family, had dug this by hand. The following morning, the drilling company's lead hydrologist arrived. After examining the tunnel entrance, he shook his head. I've only seen photographs of systems like this. Margaret smiled. Until today. He knelt beside the opening. If the gallery is still intact. He paused. There could be a tremendous amount of groundwater moving beneath us. Richard Donnelly overheard every word. Walter noticed the change immediately. The banker stopped looking at the ranch like a failed investment. Now, he looked at it like an opportunity. Walter didn't like that look. Not one bit. Later that afternoon, Richard approached him again. The bank would like to discuss purchasing your remaining redemption rights. Walter looked up from sharpening a shovel. My what? We're prepared to offer generous settlement. Walter understood. If he accepted, the bank would own everything before the truth came out. He folded the offer without reading the number. No. Richard smiled politely. You haven't heard the amount. I don't need to. It could change your life. Walter looked toward the old caterpillar. It already has. That night, only Walter, Margaret, and Ben Carter remained on the ranch. Lanterns illuminated the excavation. The stars above were painfully bright. Margaret sat beside the tunnel entrance. "You know what bothers me?" Walter poured coffee into 3 tin cups. "What? If this spring really is what I think it is." She looked across the valley. "Then someone went to extraordinary lengths to hide it." Ben nodded slowly. "Maybe they weren't hiding the water." Walter looked at him. "What then?" Ben answered quietly. "They were hiding it from the wrong people." No one slept much that night, because deep beneath the ranch, the steady dripping sound had become something else. Not dripping anymore, flowing, very softly, as though an underground stream had begun clearing a path that had been blocked for generations. Walter picked up his lantern and crawled several feet into the ancient tunnel. The beam caught something embedded in the stone wall. It wasn't natural. It wasn't part of the tunnel. It was a rusted iron handle, attached to what looked like a massive underground gate, and carved into the limestone above it were 6 words that stopped all 3 of them cold. "Open only when the land is dying." Walter Harper stared at the words carved into the limestone wall. "Open only when the land is dying." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The lantern light trembled across the stone as the 3 old friends stood in complete silence. Ben Carter finally whispered, "Whoever carved that believed this day would come." Margaret slowly brushed centuries of dust from the iron handle. "It isn't decorative." Walter looked at the heavy mechanism disappearing into the rock. "It's a valve." The hydrologist, who had returned after receiving Walter's late-night phone call, squeezed into the tunnel behind them. One glance was enough. "My goodness!" He knelt beside the iron assembly. "This isn't a gate for people." He ran his fingers along the corroded hinges. "It's a water control gate. A forgotten piece of engineering. Long before diesel pumps and electric irrigation systems, ranchers and engineers often relied on gravity. If a spring emerged high enough in the landscape, carefully built stone galleries could collect groundwater and guide it through underground channels. A heavy iron gate controlled the flow, keep it closed, and the water stayed safely underground during wet years. Open it during severe drought, and gravity carried water naturally across lower ground. It required no fuel, no electricity, and almost no maintenance, only patience and careful construction. Many of these systems disappeared as modern wells replaced them, and countless records were lost. The engineering wasn't primitive. It was remarkably efficient, designed to work for generations rather than decades. Walter wrapped both hands around the rusted handle. It refused to move. Ben joined him. Still nothing. Margaret handed Walter a can of penetrating oil from the tool bag. He smiled. "Good thing I brought the right tools." "No," Ben said, looking toward the tunnel entrance. "You brought the right machine." Outside, the Caterpillar D6 idled patiently beneath the morning sun. Walter disappeared into the toolbox mounted behind the seat and returned with an old chain his father had forged decades earlier. This chain pulled cedar stumps in '62. Ben grinned. "Let's see if it still remembers how." The chain disappeared into the tunnel. Walter fastened it carefully around the iron lever. No jerking, no rushing, just steady pressure. He climbed back onto the Caterpillar. The familiar diesel settled into its deep rhythm. Walter eased the crawler forward. The chain tightened. Nothing happened. Another inch. Steel groaned somewhere beneath the earth. The spectators held their breath. Another inch. A sound echoed to the tunnel unlike anything anyone present had ever heard. It wasn't breaking. It was waking. Stone scraped against stone. Iron protested after decades of silence. Then the handle moved. Only an inch. Then 2. Walter never increased the throttle. He simply let the Caterpillar do what it had always done. Pull. Patiently. Relentlessly. The gate finally swung open with a thunderous rumble that echoed beneath the entire hillside. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Richard Donnelly folded his arms. "I suppose that's that." Walter kept staring toward the forgotten hole. He had waited 40 years. He could wait another minute. Then came the sound, a deep rushing beneath the ground. Not loud, powerful. The forgotten hole trembled. Dust collapsed inward. and crystal clear water burst upward before spilling gently across a shallow stone channel hidden beneath decades of grass. No explosion, no geyser, just life quietly returning to the land. Walter removed his cap. Nobody spoke. Even Richard Donnelly stood speechless. The dry western pasture that experts had declared worthless was drinking again. Within weeks, independent hydrologists confirmed what Samuel Harper had protected all those years earlier. The underground spring wasn't a small seep. It was one of the largest natural recharge systems in the county. The ancient tunnel network carried fresh groundwater beneath much of the valley. It wasn't oil. It wasn't gold. It was something far more valuable in ranch country. Reliable water. The foreclosure process stopped almost immediately. New legal reviews uncovered survey records proving the bank had relied on incomplete historical assessments during the property's valuation. Walter didn't become rich overnight. He became something far rarer. He became free. The ranch stayed in Harper hands, not because of luck, because one family had listened to the land longer than anyone else. Richard Donnelly returned several weeks later. This time he wasn't carrying contracts. He was carrying an apology. I judged the ranch by its balance sheet. Walter smiled gently. The land doesn't read balance sheets. Richard laughed quietly. No, it doesn't. Before leaving, he walked into the machine shed. The Caterpillar sat exactly where Walter had parked it. He rested a hand against its worn blade. I used to think this old thing was holding you back. Walter looked at the faded yellow paint. It was carrying me forward. Richard nodded. I understand that now. 10 years later, the drought of the early 1980s became another chapter in county history. The Harper Ranch became something else. Students from agricultural colleges visited every summer to study the restored spring gallery. Engineers photographed the stone tunnel. Historians documented the forgotten craftsmanship. But the most photographed object on the ranch wasn't underground. It was still the old Caterpillar D6. Children climbed onto its tracks while Walter patiently explained every lever. He never polished it. He never restored the faded paint. The scratches, he liked to say, are part of the owner's manual. Margaret Ellis eventually published a book documenting the valley's forgotten water systems. The first copy sat on Walter's kitchen table. Its dedication read, "For those who trusted old stories before modern certainty." Ben Carter passed away peacefully at 92. At his funeral, Walter parked the Caterpillar beside the church. No speeches were necessary. Everyone understood why it was there. Walter himself lived long enough to see his granddaughter, Emily, take over the ranch. She learned to operate the Caterpillar before she learned to drive a pickup. On quiet evenings, Walter would sit on the porch watching the spring water flow through green pastures that had once been written off as dead. One autumn morning, he simply didn't wake up. He passed peacefully in the same farmhouse where Eleanor had stitched the tractor seat all those years before. At his request, there was no polished monument. Instead, Emily placed a small wooden sign beside the restored spring. It carried only 7 words. Listen carefully. The land remembers everything. The Caterpillar still starts every season. Its paint is even more faded now. Its engine carries a few more hours. But every spring, when Emily opens the irrigation channel, the old crawler rumbles toward the western pasture, exactly as Walter once did. Some visitors ask why she still uses a 70-year-old machine. She simply smiles, because it still keeps its promises. Some things are never truly forgotten. They simply wait beneath the surface until someone patient enough, humble enough, and stubborn enough remembers where to dig. If you've ever known someone who refused to give up on an old farm, an old machine, or a piece of land everyone else had written off, I'd love to hear their story in the comments. I read every one because those stories deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to hear about the rancher who had an entire steam engine inside an abandoned grain elevator for 12 years, so the bank couldn't take it, there's another remarkable story waiting. I hope you'll join me for that one, too.